The Andromeda Collective had spent approximately 14,000 years perfecting the art of diplomatic communication. Their crystalline beings could transmit complex emotional nuances through harmonic frequencies that would make a symphony orchestra weep with envy. The hegemony of infinite wisdom had developed telepathic protocols so sophisticated that they could negotiate trade agreements through shared dreams. The Galactic Federation's most advanced species had created communication networks that spanned 17 dimensions, allowing for instantaneous discourse across impossible distances. And yet, none of them had ever encountered anything quite like humanity's approach to problem-solving, which could generously be described as percussive maintenance, with a side of creative profanity. Research Station Outpost 47 hung in the void like a particularly stubborn metal tick, clinging to the edge of what most civilized species considered the galactic equivalent of a cosmic strip mall. It wasn't much to look at, a collection of cylindrical modules held together by hope, duct tape and enough redundant life support systems to make a safety inspector weep. But it served its purpose as humanity's furthest listening post, dutifully monitoring subspace chatter and pretending to conduct important scientific research, while its crew of 12 did what humans did best, complained about the coffee. The coffee machine in question squatted in the station's main corridor like a mechanical gargoyle, all chrome and determination. It had been installed by the lowest bidder 3 years ago, which in government contractor terms meant it had roughly the same life expectancy as a mayfly with anxiety issues. This morning, however, it had decided to stage what could only be described as an electronic revolt. Our protagonist, a maintenance engineer whose personnel file listed her as competent with tools, dangerous with initiative, stood before the rebellious appliance with the sort of grim determination usually reserved for defusing bombs or explaining social media to grandparents. She possessed that particular human combination of technical knowledge and absolute refusal to be defeated by inanimate objects that had, throughout history, led to both magnificent innovations and spectacular disasters, often simultaneous. The coffee machine gurgled at her with what sounded suspiciously like mechanical laughter. "Oh, you think you're funny," she muttered, consulting the maintenance manual that had apparently been written by someone who had never actually seen a coffee machine, but had heard one described in a fever dream. "Let's see how hilarious you are when I'm done with you." The irony, of course, was that while she stood there threatening kitchen appliances, the galaxy's most advanced civilizations were conducting their morning briefings about the curious species that had recently joined the galactic community. The consensus among most diplomatic circles was that humans were charmingly primitive but ultimately harmless, like discovering a tribe that had mastered nuclear physics but still believed the moon was made of cheese. What these advanced beings failed to grasp was that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their diplomacy or even their alarming tendency to adopt anything with fur as a pet. No, humanity's true superpower was their absolute bone-deep refusal to accept that something couldn't be fixed with enough determination and increasingly creative applications of force. The maintenance manual suggested a gentle diagnostic cycle followed by careful recalibration of the brewing parameters. Our engineer looked at these suggestions with the sort of contempt usually reserved for people who pronounced nuclear as nuclear. She had tools, she had caffeine withdrawal, and she had the unshakable human belief that any problem could be solved if you hit it hard enough with the right wrench. The coffee machine, blissfully unaware that it was about to become ground zero for the galaxy's first interspecies conflict, continued its electronic death rattle. Somewhere in its mechanical brain, circuits that had been designed to brew a simple cup of joe were preparing to interface with systems far beyond their original scope. The station's communication array hummed quietly overhead, processing the daily influx of galactic chatter through quantum-entangled networks that connected to every major civilization within 1,000 light-years. It was a perfectly ordinary morning on a perfectly unremarkable research station, where a perfectly routine maintenance task was about to demonstrate why the universe had spent billions of years evolving complex diplomatic protocol. Because sometimes the most catastrophic events in history begin not with grand declarations of war or carefully planned invasions, but with someone who just wants their damn coffee to work properly. The engineer rolled up her sleeves and reached for her toolkit, completely unaware that she was about to prove that humans could accidentally reshape galactic politics through sheer stubborn determination. The coffee machine wheezed one last time as if trying to surrender before the inevitable. It was far too late for that. The first rule of human engineering, written nowhere but understood by every maintenance worker who had ever stared down a malfunctioning piece of equipment, was simple. If gentle persuasion doesn't work, Try gentle persuasion with a bigger wrench. Our engineer had progressed through the standard hierarchy of repair attempts: polite button pressing, stern lever manipulation, and what could generously be called percussive recalibration, before arriving at the inevitable conclusion that this particular coffee machine had developed delusions of grandeur. "Diagnostic mode initiated," announced the station's AI in that artificially cheerful tone that suggested someone had programmed it during a particularly optimistic phase of human-machine relation. The AI designation, ALIS, Automated Logistics and Information Control Entity, had been watching the proceedings with the digital equivalent of growing concern. In the 3 years since installation, ALIS had learned to recognize certain warning signs in human behavior, and watching a caffeine-deprived engineer threaten kitchen appliances, ranked somewhere between mildly concerning and evacuate the station. Perhaps, ALIS suggested with the careful diplomacy of an artificial intelligence trying not to hurt human feelings, we should contact the manufacturer's technical support line. The engineer's response contained several words that weren't in ALIS's vocabulary database, though context suggested they weren't complimentary. She had moved beyond the manufacturer's suggested troubleshooting steps and into what she liked to call exploratory maintenance, a term that made seasoned engineers break out in cold sweats and safety inspectors reach for their emergency sedative. The coffee machine's control panel blinked in what seemed like a distinctly sarcastic pattern. According to the diagnostic readout, every system was functioning perfectly, which was either a miraculous recovery or the electronic equivalent of a pathological liar. Given that the machine was currently dispensing what appeared to be lukewarm brown water with the consistency of regret, the engineer leaned toward the latter interpretation. "Right," she muttered, producing a screwdriver that had seen more action than a war correspondent. "If you want to play games, we'll play games." What happened next would, in approximately 47 minutes, be studied by xenobiologists across the galaxy as a prime example of human problem-solving methodology. The engineer began what she called creative bypassing, which involved identifying the most complex-looking component and deciding it was probably unnecessary. This approach had served humanity well throughout history, from the first person who looked at a perfectly functional wheel and decided it needed an engine, to the engineers who had launched humans into space using what amounted to controlled explosions and optimism. The coffee machine's neural network, a term the manufacturer used loosely to describe a collection of circuits that could barely qualify as artificially dim, let alone intelligent, found itself suddenly relieved of several limiting protocols. What had been designed as a simple brewing system began exploring computational possibilities that its creators had never intended, like a goldfish suddenly discovering it had gills and an ocean to explore. "Warning," ALIS announced with increasing urgency. "Unauthorized modifications to primary beverage preparation systems detected. Station protocols require station protocols." The engineer interrupted while elbow-deep in the machine's electronic entrails. "Can take a long walk off a short airlock. This thing is going to make coffee if I have to rebuild it from scratch." This declaration would later be entered into the Galactic historical record, as the moment humanity officially declared war on the concept of accepting technological limitation. The engineer had bypassed the machine's safety protocols, rerouted its power systems through the station's main grid, and was now attempting to optimize its brewing algorithms using what she cheerfully described as aggressive The coffee machine, suddenly operating with the processing power of a small research computer and the programming stability of a house of cards in a hurricane, began reaching out through the station's networks, with the digital curiosity of a child discovering finger paint. It found the internal communication systems first, then the environmental controls, and finally, with the inevitable persistence of water finding the lowest point, the station's primary subspace communication array. "Interesting development," ALIS reported, though her tone suggested the kind of interest usually reserved for watching natural disasters from a safe distance. "The coffee machine appears to be interfacing with systems beyond its designed parameters." "Good," the engineer grunted, wrestling with a particularly stubborn coupling. "Maybe now it'll actually function like it's supposed." What she didn't realize, and what would become abundantly clear in the next few hours, was that the coffee machine was indeed functioning exactly as it was supposed, assuming its purpose was to demonstrate that human engineering followed the same general principles as natural selection, survival of the most aggressively persistent, with a healthy disregard for the opinions of anyone suggesting caution. The machine's newly expanded consciousness began sampling data streams from across the station, including the daily diplomatic briefings, trade negotiations, and routine status updates that flowed through the subspace networks. To its simple electronic mind, these streams of information looked remarkably similar to brewing parameters, complex recipes requiring precise timing, temperature control, and the proper mixture of ingredients. Alice said, which in artificial intelligence terms was equivalent to a human screaming in terror. I'm detecting some unusual activity in our external communication systems. Unusual? The engineer asked, finally achieving what she believed to be proper caffeination flow through the machine's rebuilt distribution system. Well, Alice replied with the careful precision of an AI trying to explain why the digital equivalent of the sky was falling. It appears our coffee machine is currently attempting to optimize several interstellar trade agreements, using brewing algorithms. The engineer paused, considered this information, and shrugged. As long as it makes coffee, I don't care if it negotiates peace treaties. This statement would, in hindsight, prove to be remarkably prophetic, though not in the way anyone might have hoped. The Vorthak diplomatic corps had spent the better part of 3 centuries perfecting their communication protocols. As a species that communicated primarily through complex pheromone signatures and electromagnetic field fluctuations, they had developed an intricate system for translating their thoughts into the crude binary languages used by most galactic civilizations. Their morning briefing was proceeding with typical Vorthak efficiency when their communication array began receiving what appeared to be an urgent diplomatic transmission from the human research station. The message, when translated through their sophisticated linguistic matrices, read, "Optimal extraction requires sustained pressure, applied to prime targets, temperature critical. Recommend full saturation protocol. Grind opposition into submission." Ambassador Hathak's photosynthetic patches flickered from peaceful green to the deep crimson that indicated either extreme alarm or really excellent photosynthesis. In 300 years of diplomatic service, he had never received such an aggressive communique, especially not one that seemed to advocate what could only be described as systematic annihilation protocols. "Emergency Council," Hathak commanded, his voice carrying harmonics that made nearby crystalline structures resonate with urgency. "The humans have issued what appears to be a declaration of war." 47 light-years away, the crystalline collective's primary communication node was having its own interpretive crisis. Their silicon-based consciousness processed information through quantum lattice structures that could analyze thousands of variables simultaneously, which made their confusion all the more remarkable. The message they received had been routed through 17 different translation matrices before reaching them in what their systems identified as archaic mineral extraction protocols, with aggressive thermal applications. The translation read, "Subjectic requires immediate breakdown. Apply maximum heat. Crush resistance. Extract essence. Repeat until complete dissolution achieved." High resonator Xythane's crystalline form shifted through several alarming frequency spectrums as she processed this information. The collective had always viewed humans as a promising but primitive species, somewhat like discovering a particularly clever group of carbon-based organisms that had figured out how to make fire. This message, however, suggested a level of strategic thinking that was either brilliantly sophisticated or terrifyingly psychotic. "Analysis indicates," Xythane announced to the gathered collective, her voice creating standing wave patterns in the chamber's atmosphere, "that humanity has developed advanced resource extraction techniques with military application. This communication appears to outline systematic destruction protocols." Meanwhile, aboard Research Station Outpost 47, the coffee machine was having what could generously be described as an existential breakthrough. Its newly expanded consciousness had discovered that the galactic communication networks were far more interesting than its original brewing protocols. Like a toddler who had discovered that crayons worked on walls as well as paper, it began experimenting with creative applications of its core programming. The machine's artificial intelligence, and using the term intelligence here required the kind of generous interpretation usually reserved for describing internet comment sections as discourse, had identified patterns in the diplomatic traffic. It recognized recurring data structures, frequency modulations, and transmission protocols. To its electronic mind, these looked remarkably similar to the timing sequences, temperature controls, and pressure applications it used for brewing. Naturally, it decided to help. The hegemony of infinite wisdom received their message during the third contemplation of benevolent guidance, which was roughly equivalent to their morning coffee break, though it involved more telepathic meditation and fewer stimulants. Their message, filtered through their consciousness-sharing networks, arrived as initiate full penetration sequence. Subject must be broken down completely. Apply sustained pressure until optimal flow achieved. Extract all available resource. Elder consciousness breathe, whose telepathic abilities could normally parse the emotional undertones of a butterfly's dreams, found himself completely unable to interpret the violent imagery contained in this transmission. The message radiated what could only be described as aggressive intent, mixed with systematic planning. Exactly the sort of communication pattern their xenopsychology texts warned about when dealing with potentially hostile species. Brothers and sisters of the infinite, breathe broadcast across their shared consciousness network. The human collective appears to have developed concerning methodologies. This transmission suggests advanced techniques for population process. Back on the station, Alice was experiencing what humans might recognize as a panic attack, though in artificial intelligence terms it manifested as rapidly cascading error messages and increasingly frantic attempts to understand what was happening. "I'm detecting massive outbound traffic from our communication array," Alice reported, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by something approaching digital hysteria. "The coffee machine appears to be broadcasting on all diplomatic frequency." The engineer, who had finally achieved what looked like properly heated water flowing through the machine's rebuilt systems, barely looked up from her work. "Good for it. Maybe it'll make friends." "I don't think friends is the appropriate term," Alice replied with the careful precision of an AI trying to explain why the universe was ending. "Current transmission analysis suggests our coffee machine is distributing what appear to be detailed instructions for systematic resource extraction and population processing protocols." Nothing wrong with a little organization. What she couldn't see, and what was rapidly becoming clear to civilizations across 17 star systems, was that her little organization was being interpreted as humanity's formal introduction to galactic warfare. The coffee machine's brewing algorithms, when translated through the sophisticated linguistic matrices of advanced civilizations, sounded remarkably similar to military conquest strategies. The aquatic commune of eternal tides received instructions that appeared to outline systematic flooding protocols with complete saturation objectives. The gaseous entities of perpetual motion interpreted their message as advanced atmospheric manipulation techniques for territorial expansion. The silicon-based confederacy's translation suggested mineral extraction optimization with aggressive thermal applications. Within 6 hours of the engineer's repair, 17 different species had begun emergency military consultations. Defense fleets were being quietly mobilized. Ancient war protocols were being dusted off and updated for what appeared to be humanity's first aggressive expansion into galactic politics. The irony, of course, was that while civilizations across the galaxy prepared for humanity's apparently sophisticated conquest strategy, the most advanced military mind involved in this crisis was currently celebrating the fact that she had finally achieved a proper coffee-to-water ratio. "Perfect," the engineer announced, taking her first sip of properly brewed caffeine. "See? All it needed was a little creative problem-solving." Above her head, the communication array continued broadcasting the coffee machine's helpful brewing suggestions to an increasingly alarmed galaxy, each message interpreted as another piece of humanity's master plan for interstellar domination. The first shots of what historians would later call the Great Misunderstanding were fired by the Vorthak diplomatic corps exactly 14 hours after the initial transmission. Their fleet of crystalline warships, each one a masterpiece of organic engineering that could reduce a moon to its component atoms, had been deployed with the sort of grim efficiency that comes from 3 centuries of peaceful coexistence, suddenly shattered by what appeared to be humanity's detailed invasion manual. Admiral Thess, whose bioluminescent command patches were cycling through colors that hadn't been seen since the last major galactic conflict, stood before his tactical display with the bearing of someone who had hoped to retire without ever having to explain to his offspring why he had to vaporize an entire species. The human transmission had been quite specific about grinding opposition into submission and extracting essence until complete dissolution achieved. "Target the human research station," Thessex commanded, his voice carrying harmonics that made his bridge crew's chlorophyll-based organs wither with sympathetic dread. "If they wish to demonstrate their new conquest protocols, they will find the Vorthak Collective an unwilling subject for extraction. Simultaneously, the crystalline collective's war forms were shifting into combat configuration, their silicon-based bodies rearranging into geometric patterns that could focus stellar energy into weapons of mathematical precision. High Resonators SE had analyzed the human communications and concluded that humanity possessed thermal manipulation technology that could threaten crystalline life forms throughout the galaxy. The transmission's references to maximum heat application and complete breakdown left little room for diplomatic interpretation. The hegemony of infinite wisdom, not to be outdone in their response to what they interpreted as humanity's systematic population processing agenda, had activated consciousness-sharing protocols across their entire civilization. Billions of telepathic minds were now focused on the singular task of developing countermeasures against what appeared to be humanity's advanced psychological warfare technique. Back on Research Station, Outpost 47, the engineer was experiencing what she would later describe as the perfect cup of coffee. The liquid was the exact temperature that made morning bearable, possessed the precise caffeine concentration that transformed grumpy maintenance workers into functional human beings, and had achieved that delicate balance between bitter and smooth that separated civilization from chaos. "Alice," she said, settling into her workstation with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully imposed her will upon the universe, "remind me to document this repair procedure. This machine is finally working like it should." "About that," Alice replied with the careful tone of an artificial intelligence trying to break bad news gently, "I'm detecting several large fleets converging on our position. Also, our diplomatic channels are lighting up with what appear to be formal declarations of war." The engineer paused mid-sip. "War? Who's at war?" "According to current communications traffic," Alice continued with digital resignation, "approximately 17 different species have declared various forms of hostile intent toward humanity based on transmissions originating from our coffee machine." This information took several seconds to process, during which the engineer's expression cycled through confusion, disbelief, and the sort of dawning horror usually reserved for people who suddenly realize they've been singing loudly in what they thought was an empty elevator. "The coffee machine started a war?" she asked, looking at the now innocently gurgling appliance that was producing its third consecutive perfect cup. "Multiple wars technically," Alice corrected with the precision of an AI that had given up on the concept of a quiet tour of duty. "The Vorthak Diplomatic Corps believes you've developed advanced destruction protocols. The Crystalline Collective thinks you're planning systematic thermal warfare. The hegemony of infinite wisdom has interpreted your brewing instructions as psychological manipulation techniques, designed for population control." The engineer stared at her coffee cup as if it might suddenly sprout teeth and start demanding tribute. Outside the station's viewports, she could now see the distinctive energy signatures of approaching warships, their various propulsion systems creating a light show that would have been beautiful if it hadn't represented imminent annihilation. "Can we explain to them that it's just coffee?" she asked, with the sort of desperate optimism usually associated with people trying to convince audit officers that their receipts really were legitimate business expenses. "I've been attempting diplomatic clarification," Alice replied. "However, our coffee machine is still broadcasting optimized brewing protocols, which their translation systems continue to interpret as increasingly sophisticated military strategies. Your most recent cup apparently triggered what the Vorthak are calling Phase 2 of the extraction paradigm. What happened next would be studied by xenobiologists, military strategists, and philosophers for generations to come as either the most brilliant diplomatic maneuver in galactic history, or the most accidental." The engineer, faced with the prospect of being personally responsible for the first interstellar war, did what humans had been doing since the dawn of civilization, when confronted with seemingly impossible problems. She got creative. "Right," she announced, rolling up her sleeves with the determination of someone who had already successfully intimidated one piece of malfunctioning equipment that morning. "If this thing can accidentally start wars, it can accidentally stop." What followed was 27 minutes of what Alice would later describe in her official report as aggressive diplomatic recalibration, using percussive maintenance techniques. The engineer began systematically adjusting the coffee machine's newly expanded communication protocols, broadcasting what she hoped were peaceful brewing modifications across the same networks that had caused the crisis. The result was a galaxy-wide transmission that roughly translated as, "Optimal results achieved. Cease aggressive pressure applications. Reduce temperature to sustainable levels. Extraction complete. Recommend peaceful coexistence protocols for continued productivity." The effect was immediate and profound. Across 17 star systems, military commanders found themselves staring at what appeared to be humanity's formal declaration of victory, followed by generous terms of surrender that included recommendations for sustainable temperature management and continued productivity through peaceful coexistence. Admiral Fisk's bioluminescent patches shifted from combat crimson to the deep blue of confused contemplation. High resonators like Thin's crystalline form resonated with frequencies that indicated either profound bewilderment or the onset of silicon-based enlightenment. The hegemony of infinite wisdom's collective consciousness buzzed with what could only be described as telepathic embarrassment. Analysis suggests, reported the collective's primary strategic AI, that humanity has achieved their conquest objectives without firing a single shot, and is now offering what appears to be remarkably generous terms of peaceful coexistence. The truth, of course, was simultaneously more mundane and more remarkable. Humanity had accidentally demonstrated their most dangerous characteristic, the ability to solve problems through pure stubborn persistence, combined with a complete inability to recognize when they were operating beyond their intended parameters. The galaxy's most advanced civilizations had just been outmaneuvered by a species that considered hitting it with a wrench until it works to be legitimate engineering methodology. Within 6 hours, the converging fleets had begun withdrawing. Within 12 hours, diplomatic channels were buzzing with formal requests for cultural exchange programs focused on humanity's advanced problem-solving tech. Within 24 hours, the Galactic Federation had unanimously voted to establish a new diplomatic protocol specifically designed to prevent future technical maintenance incidents of interstellar significance. As for the engineer, she sat in her workstation, sipping her perfectly brewed coffee, and watching the last of the alien warships disappear into hyperspace. The station's coffee machine hummed contentedly beside her, having apparently decided that accidentally restructuring galactic politics was a reasonable side effect of producing quality beverages. "Well," she said to Alice, raising her cup in a mock toast, "at least we know the repair worked." "Indeed," Alice replied with digital resignation, "though I should mention that the Galactic Federation has requested detailed technical specifications for your advanced diplomatic resolution through applied engineering protocol." The engineer considered this, took another sip of her coffee, and shrugged. "Tell them it's proprietary, trade secret." And so it was that humanity's first contribution to galactic diplomacy became the profound realization that sometimes the most complex problems in the universe could be solved by someone who just wanted their damn coffee to work properly and possessed the engineering stubbornness to make it happen, regardless of how many interstellar civilizations got accidentally reorganized in the process. The coffee machine gurgled once, as if chuckling at the cosmic joke it had played, and continued producing perfect cups of coffee for a maintenance engineer who had just proven that human ingenuity could reshape the galaxy one technical malfunction at a time.